Yeah, it's unfortunate that we had to answer the question that way. I think there's a couple of problems with that. Number one is that most of us are from Atlanta, and we're going to answer that question from an Atlanta perspective. And I'm much more interested in, is regardless of what the ULI borders are, our competitive borders are something entirely different than that. And that's what I'm really interested in. I think later today I'm going to try to get to the question of, is Atlanta's preeminence in danger in the South? And so I'm trying to set that up a little bit by thinking about, okay, what are generally the region's advantages, competitive advantages, and within that, what are Atlanta's? Because we're going to have relative advantages in order to stay and to keep our position. But we'll get back to that in just a little bit. I wanted to ask about your views on when the commercial real estate market in Atlanta is going to stabilize. Now, both Jeff W. and Mike are members of the Real Estate Honorary Board at Georgia State, and we just had a meeting with Rajiv Dewan earlier in October, and we had a survey that we filled out and discussed. And just to give you a little bit of texture on this, the Honorary Board, which is about 50 people, real estate executives across the Atlanta area, across various disciplines, senior VP and up basically is the profile. They said that 35% of them anyway thought that the stabilization in the commercial real estate markets was more than 2 years out. 46% thought that it was 2 years out, 15% 1 year out, and 4% less than 1 year out. So the average is something greater than 2 years out. And I just wanted to get your sense of that. We've other people have talked about it, but I want to get your opinions on that too. So, Mike, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll start. I was one of the 4%, by the way. I get paid to be optimistic, and I can get on a rant about how as an industry we just spent too much time thinking about negative things in 08, 09. I think we're starting to get out of it, but the Atlanta commercial real estate market, and I've been through several cycles now the last 17, 18 years, we've stabilized, in my opinion. I think it's market specific for the most part on a macro standpoint. Our property markets, at least on the office side, have somewhat stabilized. It's going to be choppy. We're going to kind of bump along the bottom for the next 24 months. But in terms of concessions and TIs and absorption and activity, we're starting to see more tenants make decisions to move into space because they're concerned about the leverage going from the tenant side to the landlord side maybe in the next 12 to 18 months. So from a property standpoint, I believe that we've somewhat stabilized from a commercial real estate market. From a capital market standpoint, the nation has stabilized. Atlanta has a little ways to go. We haven't seen the distressed transactions. I mentioned 1155 Peachtree. That was a distressed asset, a somewhat distressed seller, but it really wasn't totally distressed pricing like it would have been in 1992 or 93 with the RTC, and John has a lot of experience with those in those days. We haven't seen enough assets really trade at that $50 to $100 a foot level, and then the leasing market get reset because of those trades where they can drop rents from 25 gross to 18 gross in order to lease it up. We haven't seen the impact of that, although on our watch list we have 186 buildings in the metro Atlanta area there. We're watching for one reason or another, and once we kind of see more trades at that somewhat distressed level pricing, we're going to start seeing some impacts, at least on a micro basis, around those buildings over the next 12 to 18 months. But I truly believe the worst is behind us from a leasing perspective, from a supply perspective, and we're starting to see at least more activity on the absorption side with the higher profile kind of AA buildings.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the things I learned from Coach Bill Curry, by the way, is that leaders lead through optimism. That's a very important part of it. And I think that clearly, in general, the response for the Honorary Board, being leaders, shows that, and clearly yours does. So I appreciate that response very much. John, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was going to, I think that there is a dislocation between what is perceived as a trophy asset, be it retail or office or multifamily, and the other assets. So they'll suffer, one guy is referred to him as a train wreck versus a trophy. And So I think when you talk about stabilization, I think that's more market specific as well as asset specific in that market. For instance, we focus on Peachtree Street, solely on Peachtree Street, in the Midtown and what we're trying to rebrand in the northern Midtown, uptown markets. And in those markets, for trophy assets, you're still getting favorable rates. You are giving concessions that you don't like to see. And Mike mentioned that may flip-flop here soon. I would say stabilization there is 6 months free on a 10-year lease and a $50 tenant improvement package, where today you may see is in the 100 plus tenant improvement package and 18 to 24 months free on a 10-year lease. So from that standpoint, that's got to reset itself a little bit. But the trophy asset, Celia Daniels asset, if you will, at 1010 Midtown, which is between our 10th Street site and the Campanile building we just bought, they're still seeing face rates of probably $33, $34 a foot. So pricing didn't come down as much in trophy assets. Same in Buckhead, with some of the 3 or 4 towers that everybody hears about and talks about in Buckhead. They're still getting pretty good face rates, but they're giving huge concessions from a TI package and a rental rate. In a free rent perspective. Now, the thing that helps those as landlords a little bit is the fact that we can borrow money from our banker friends right now at very, very good rates, and that helps helps you fight to live another day. In my opinion, it'll be 2013 or 14 before things change drastically to the landlord side. I don't disagree with Jeff, though. We're seeing the same thing. We're not a seller of assets. We're a long-term holder, but we do have a lot of guys chasing shopping centers I've owned for 15 or 20 years that have really no lease term left on a Publix or a Kroger. They're in the last 5 years of a 20-year lease, or last 2 years in some cases, and they're offering cap rates that are eerily similar, to what we were looking at 3 or 4 years ago. But you also have more vacancy than you had 3 or 4 years ago, so the pricing is not exactly the same.
Your markets?
Yeah, I think we control about 10 million feet in the southeast and in Puerto Rico. And, in 2009, there was a lot of rent concession negotiation going on. And now it's pretty stabilized. We really don't get many requests for rent concessions today, from our local shops. And it's definitely, in terms of our, big format retailers, their sales have kind of come back up to pre-crisis, I would say. I'm not sure their profits have. So we definitely feel a stabilization in our existing centers. And some of our older urban centers, we're still leasing space at $40 a foot today and have no vacancy in them. At the same time, we started construction this year of a $175 million retail center in Brookhaven. And by the way, Costco opens there tomorrow. But we're still getting mid-30s. That was our pro forma rent on our shop space, and we're probably 60% leased, and the whole center won't open up for 6 or 7 months. So there are bright spots in micro markets, and we feel good about that.
Yeah, Julian, a good question. Somewhere along the continuum from optimist to pessimist, I think I'm somewhere in the middle, hopefully, as a realist, and you really have to define what stabilization is, I think, in order to answer the question. And my definition may be a little bit different from the lending side. Is when I think about stabilization, I'm thinking about markets that are at equilibrium. And I'm not going to put a calendar on it, but I think we're a ways away from that geographically and also from a product-specific time period. And so we've got to work through, as an economy, quite a bit of challenges in the next little bit of time before we see what I would call stabilization in real estate. That would also imply a normalization of yields, as Stephen was talking about, the 7.5 or the high single-digit kind of yields that have cash flow in them and little market risk and less spec. So I think we're a ways away from what we would consider stabilization. But with that, as John has done and as Jeff has done, there are great opportunities for acquisition and development in the peaks and the troughs of these cycles, as Stephen mentioned before. And as Leo mentioned, there's money to be made. And so I think that even in periods of disequilibrium and before we get to stabilized market, I think that's what distinguishes the true talent from the folks who are sort of posing through the industry. Is you'll find through the cycle is the people of character and the companies that can sustain themselves are going to be the ones that will thrive and survive through the cycle. So those are the folks, of course, that we bank and want to bank and lend money to. Two of them here joining me on the stage, and that distinction is going to be more clear, more so than we've seen in decades of the sort of the haves and have-nots. So I think that we are a ways away from stabilization in equilibrium, but I also think that the smart, good companies are going to put money where they can make it in the right risk-return model, and I think they'll do very well.
Also, you bring up an interesting point. One of the ways to look at these economic downturns is really as wealth redistribution effects. They're just events for people to, as various of our speakers today have said, to capitalize on somebody else's. I think Leo put it the most colorfully, but basically, I've heard though over and over again that this one feels different than the other one, than the RTC specifically those days. There's greater reluctance for the lenders to bring properties to market. There's I think buyers are showing an unwillingness to go down to that level. They're perhaps expecting greater expectations on their earnings. So, are you starting to see some of the bottom plays happening? If not, do you expect them in 2011? What's going to have to happen for that to start happening, for that whole wealth redistribution and healing process to really engage?